guess we could start with introductions maybe and see if the other two members join us at some point. Great. Well, we're now live, so welcome everyone to the second meeting of the committee to study the feasibility of creating basic income security. We'll start with introductions, beginning with Senator Moore.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mary Ann Moore, and I represent Senate District 6, which is all of Washington County, as well as Goldsboro, Winter Harbor, and Sullivan in Hancock County as well.
Okay, great. And then next we'll go to Representative Rotor.
Hi, I'm Representative Amy Rader. I represent a portion of Bangor. It's District 125.
Okay, and how about Sass? You want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Sass Linigan. I am a member of the public who has lived in lots of poverty.
Okay, and Lori?
Good afternoon. I'm Lori Moses. I live in Sebago, and I work in the childcare and I represent business and industry.
Okay, and Michael Howard?
I'm Michael Howard. I teach in the philosophy department at the University of Maine, and I'm representing higher education on the committee.
Okay. And then the person who's on the phone, I didn't catch the name. If you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Tracy Ballinger. I'm the trade labor representative. I am a letter carrier in Portland, a member of the National Association of Letter Carriers Union, and I'm on the board of the Maine State AFL-CIO.
Okay, great. And Representative Madigan?
Hi, I'm Colleen Madigan. I represent House District 110, which is about half of Waterville and a little bit of Oakland.
Excellent.
And I'm the House co-chair.
Excellent. And I'm Senator Ben Chipman. I represent Senate District 27, which is part of the city of Portland. I also serve as chair of the Senate chair of the Taxation Committee and as the other co-chair, the Senate co-chair of this committee. Also want to introduce to everyone Steve Langland, who's one of our analysts, as well as Lynn Caswell, who are serving as analysts for our committee. And before we get started, is any questions from anybody or comments, or should we just jump right into the agenda? Not seeing anything. So just following our agenda, we have next item is for committee discussion and decision about sort of what we want to do and maybe pick up where we left off last time with the different options that we have in front of us. If anybody would like to start out with that discussion, or if you want to maybe walk through the options again briefly with us, Steve, so we can know what we have to consider here.
Yeah, I did want to point out after our last meeting, Michael Howard had sent around a potential idea for consideration, and I'll let him speak to that. But my understanding is that it would recommend that this commission be reconstituted for a 2-year period, which would sort of allow for next year the committee to go through the feasibility study, and then the following year be able to take those results and recommend legislation and further action. But I would defer to him for his thoughts.
Okay.
Yeah, I can just
go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, I can just add to that. My thought was I realized that the first committee that was constituted was for 2 years. Even with the pandemic, we did have some time to accomplish some things and get a decent first round report. And our last conversation, we were all wondering, even in the best of circumstances, how we could avoid ending up in the same situation we're in this year, where we just don't have enough time to do the contract and get the report. So my thought was, let's aim for, emergency status, try to get started as early as possible, get a contract as early as possible. If we could finish by next December, that would be great. But if we're authorized to continue for 2 years, it would give us the option of having the study continue, and then there's still a committee to report to at the end of the second year.
Yeah. So you're sort of foreseeing something where we would ask for up to 2 years, but it wouldn't mean we would have to take 2 years. We could, if we could finish the work in a year, that would be fine. Otherwise, we could take up to 2 years.
That's right.
What do folks think about that proposal?
The only thing I would say is that if we're going past next December, then it's likely, well, it's a possibility that some of the legislators on this committee may or may not be serving. So, I mean, that's one of the considerations with things going kind of into the next session.
Right.
And plus, I agree with you, Colleen, but yeah, Representative Madigan, the other thing too is that if we are allowing them to report out a bill or legislation as a result of the study, can we legally do that to the 131st legislature? Well, I don't know if that can be done.
Yeah, so I think I can answer that question if I may. So at the end of the second year, so this would be in 2023, this committee would be able to recommend legislation and recommend legislation, I should say, to the committee with jurisdiction over labor matters. And that committee would be able to take this committee's recommendations and sort of run with them. So it is permissible.
Okay, awesome. Good.
If there was a change in legislators, how would that impact? Like, would that mean that we'd have to appoint other legislators if these were like, yeah, just curious how logistically what that means.
Say I, decide to run again next year and I don't win my reelection, then they'd have to appoint someone else to be the Senate chair, which I don't see why they wouldn't be able to just do that. I mean, they'd have to fill the vacancy like with anything else. So, I mean, if a legislator resigns in the middle of a term, they have to fill vacancies. So I don't know why that would be the problem, but.
And wouldn't we also continue to have the mandate of, I know I'm the representative from the Labor and Housing Committee, so the committee status would still be in place, I would assume.
Yeah, I would think so. So if you, ended up getting moved to another committee or didn't run again or something, they'd still have to appoint someone from that committee to serve in your place, I think, so.
I have a question, if that's okay.
Sure, go ahead.
What if the next administration, can they decommission the committee? Can they decide, the work isn't done and they're no longer interested before the work is done?
So this bill that would be reported out next session would have to be signed by this administration. And so it would still be lawful as long as this current administration signs it. So in terms of the work being disrupted by, say, the chief executive or someone, it would still be on the books as a law. So.
Right. Yeah, because it's a legislative committee. It's not something that the chief executive can just dismantle if it's a new chief executive.
Thank you.
And is this also suggesting rather than like contract it out with this group right now, picking who would take the contract during the next iteration of this committee, even if it's the same people?
Yeah, I think it would have to be. Yeah, because we're supposed to finish by December 15th, which we're obviously not going to be able to do. So
right.
One way or another, the committee would have to be reconstituted. And I guess everything's on the table at that point, it seems like. But by the, I guess it would go through the Labor and Housing Committee. Is that how this bill came about? Through the Labor and Housing. So whatever they decide to do, with this, if they go along with our recommendations and reconstitute the committee, or they do something different, and we can't really control that, but hopefully they would go along with what we suggest, but this is no guarantee. Further discussion. Are folks generally supportive of Michael Howard's idea, or you think we should go in a different direction with one of the other options, or?
I would like to hear Steve put all the options out on the table.
Yeah, maybe you could just run through all the options for us, Steve, and include Michael's in that.
Yeah.
You have a way to put everything up on a screen or something so folks can...
I don't have the documents in front of me. I'm sorry. On my computer. So the options that I presented last time were obviously the committee would have a feasibility study done by 2 days from now, which obviously is unlikely. And the other recommendation that I had on the table was that the committee could forego the feasibility study and sort of make legislative recommendations based on how it feels that the state of Maine should go forward or proceed with universal basic income. And the other option was sort of the option that Michael Howard presented, in that if the report sort of says we didn't have enough time to sort of fulfill all of our duties, and so we recommend reconstituting. I will say you had presented a couple of different ideas, I think, at the end of the last meeting. And I think maybe Lynn can sort of speak to one of those. But my recollection was that you thought potentially this committee could recommend to the Labor and Housing Committee that the Labor and Housing Committee reports out a bill in an emergency capacity that reauthorizes this committee with the same membership and requires that a subcommittee of the Labor and Housing Committee enters into a contract for a feasibility study. I don't know if the committee is still interested in that. We do have some things to raise with that issue, with that option, excuse me. I don't know if the committee is looking for sort of information on that, or I do have what I think was one more option that the committee mentioned last time. Would you like me to go through that, or would you like to hear?
Sure, that'll be fine.
Okay. So the other option was that the committee recommends to Labor and Housing in its report due in 2 days that the Labor and Housing Committee report out an emergency bill that requires the Labor and Housing Committee to contract for a feasibility study. And then the Labor and Housing Committee would assess the results of the feasibility study and then propose suggested legislation to the 131st legislature. So it sort of takes this committee itself out of the equation and sort of shifts that to the Labor and Housing Committee. And I think that was all of the options that were discussed. I'm happy to try to answer any questions between Lynn and I on those options, if you have any.
Any questions for Steve on any of the options?
I have one. So, I mean, I've gone back and forth about what to do, but asking for this committee to continue, whether the suggestion of Michael Howard or something else, really is dependent on what leadership decides to do. If they say no, then we got together once and this money was raised for essentially nothing, correct?
Well, I would say that no matter which option you choose, it's going to require a new vehicle. So if you were to choose that option, it would require Labor and Housing to report out a bill. But if you recommended that Labor and Housing do the feasibility study, they would still need to report out a bill requiring or sort of recommending that they themselves conduct the feasibility study. So either way, there's an extra step. It involves the Joint Standing Committee on Labor and Housing to take action of some kind.
Do we need leadership? I mean, like, my understanding is we right now have the authority to make recommendations, and Labor and Housing and just report out a bill without needing to go to Legislative Council or leadership to get permission to do that, right?
That's correct.
So, I mean, we're not dependent on leadership. It's what the committee, Labor and Housing, decides if they want to take a recommendation to report out a bill or not. It would be up to them. Which I would think they would want to see something happen since they passed this bill and the money was raised, but we got, shortchanged on time to be able to do it. So I don't think that would be a problem, but we wouldn't have to go through Legislative Council or anything like that. So I'm not sure how to best proceed, and we've got these different options out there. And do you have any suggestions, Representative Madigan? Should we just do like a show of hands, or what do you think? I don't know if there's anybody from the public that wants to chime in. Is there anybody from the public who's here?
Representative Bernard has raised her hand. I don't know if she has a
Yeah,
question.
go ahead, Representative Bernard. If
Okay.
you could introduce yourself as well, since you weren't here for introductions.
Right. I'm Representative Sue Bernard, and I'm from House District number 149 in Caribou, Westmanland, and New Sweden. My question is, because we were put in charge of this whole thing, and I hate to just kick the can down the road, so to speak, and I know that we haven't had enough time, but the question is, rather than hand this over to someone else, if I'm understanding correctly, it sort of makes sense to me that something is reconstituted, and probably a lot of people on this committee would be a part of it, because I think, I would like to be a part of it. I'm sure many of you want to be a part of this decision-making, as opposed to just giving it over to another committee. So if we could just have more time, asking for more time to do the work that was intended for us to do, that's what I'm thinking. So someone argue with me or clarify for me, maybe that I'm wrong.
We can't just ask for more time, because we're confined to a set time frame based on how the legislation was passed to set up the committee that we're now on right now. So we were basically given till 90 days from adjournment before the bill took effect, which was sometime in October. And then we had like a deadline of December 1. Money had to be raised, and we had to get permission to meet because there was a missing member that hadn't been appointed. So because of all that, we had our first meeting last week, and we asked for a 2-week extension, which they gave us. That's the most extension that they could give us. So we got a 2-week extension to December 15th to do a study, which I think most of us agree couldn't really happen. And we'd heard from some different entities that they couldn't do it that fast. So there's interest in doing the study, but they would need more time. And so we can't just, one of our options is not just to be able to ask for more time as the existing committee is right now. I mean, our work ceases to exist after Wednesday, and there's not much we can do about it. So we have these different options of like getting the committee to be reconstituted by Labor and Housing and passing another bill. And, the option Steve just went over, but one of the options isn't just that we can ask for more time to continue as we are, unfortunately.
Okay, I'm sorry. I probably misunderstood something that Steve said. I thought that there was something about foregoing completely, quote, the work that we've done, or moving over. I think it was your second option, Steve. I misunderstood it. So forget that. I misunderstood. And but I guess I would love the idea of, when I heard someone say reconstituting a number of people on this committee who already have a basic understanding of what it is and have put in some time toward it, it would be great if some of the folks on this committee could still be involved in the next step, whatever that is.
Yeah, I think everyone would probably agree with that. And Steve, like in our recommendation, we could be really specific about reconstituting the committee the way it is, with members representing the different interests that are represented and all of that, right? I mean, we can be pretty specific about it.
Yep, correct.
And I can say I spoke with Crystal Fawn Gamut earlier, who isn't able to be here today, and she said that if that was the option we chose, that she would be interested in still being included. So if we wanted to recommend, it was all the same people, she's on board. And I would just say that I have two different feelings. Like, one part of me is like, just give it to the committee and let it happen. But then the other part of me is like, there was a recommendation that was made when we last had this about having a permanent group that would look at like the way that our public assistance interacts and whatnot. That came directly from pressure that was put into that conversation by me and the other person who had experienced poverty. And I just really feel like having people that have experienced it and are going to be impacted by this kind of choice is so important. So even though I'm like, some part of me is like, just do whatever's going to make it quickest, I'm like, also that is white supremacy, and we need to be thinking about how we do things too. So having impacted people is going to be an important piece of this.
Lynn Caswell, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to say that one of the things that I realized when I looked into the Labor and Housing Committee being given the task of doing the work is that if it was to also include any study, it would go to the study table and would be unlikely to be voted off the study table until the end of the session. In other words, it's likely that giving this to Labor and Housing would not actually speed up the process. I think the timing would be about the same.
Right.
I remember that now, Lynn. Thanks for reminding us.
They can't just take the money that's been raised and do it without another bill because of the time frame that we're under for December 15th, so they wouldn't be able to just do that. So the money could still sit there, but nothing would happen. Okay. I have a question about that, the money that was raised. So if we recommend, as Michael Howard suggested, reconstituting the committee and giving them up to 2 years to report back and keeping the same sort of membership, does that money just sit with legislative council? Would we have something in our recommendations that they hold on to the money to be able to do the study in hopes the bill passes, or does that get returned back to whoever, the folks that raised that, and then it has to be raised again, or how does that work?
Yeah, so I can draft something. So if the Labor and Housing Committee decides to go forward with this, I can draft something in the bill that says that the committee, once it's reconstituted, is authorized to use the funds from this iteration of the committee. So the money that was raised for these 2 meetings can be used going forward.
Okay. And is there anyone from the public that's with us that you think might want to, I don't know, share their thoughts with us before we vote on anything? Or I can't see who else is here on the attendees, but can you tell if there's anybody here that might wanna
Larry's
speak?
raising hands.
Okay, so we have Larry Danzing, or should we, Representative Madigan, should we hear from members of the public before we actually make a decision, or what do you think?
Yeah.
So it looks like Larry Danzinger's raised his hand, and so maybe we can, Larry, if you could introduce yourself and share your thoughts.
Sure. My name's Larry Danzinger. I live in Bangor. I helped to raise the money that is hopefully available and usable for this study eventually. I think my 2 most important feelings, one is that being able to move the process ahead in some way is really important. And my preference would be that the committee would continue in some form because, as Sass Liniken mentioned, it's important to have people who are from a little broader segment of the community involved, if at all possible, in this, because it impacts certainly the much broader community as well, and particularly people with the lower or lowest incomes. So that would be one feeling. The other is that if a report can include what the preferences are, for example, if a preference is to have the committee continue, to say in the report, we would like to have the committee continue, the Basic Income Security Committee continue, but if not, then to have a fallback. And I think I mentioned this at the last meeting as well, to have, our preference is this, but if not, to have something else as an option so that the committee doesn't suddenly disappear and there's nothing else that can maintain the process and help things to move forward in some way, shape, or form. Including perhaps if the committee is not able to function until the spring, late spring, for example, or even summer, that the committee, if possible, can designate, at least at that time, if not sooner, a group that can do the actual feasibility study. And again, if that's not an option, then to leave it to Labor and Housing Committee to be able to designate an actual contractor for the feasibility study. Again, having that fallback option so that at least things move ahead in some way. I think that's all I can suggest at the moment.
So you're on board with Michael Howard's suggestion of recommending the committee be reconstituted, given up to 2 years to commission a study, and that the funds raised be held for that purpose, to be used for that study?
Sure, that's one way to do it. Sure. I would hope that a committee could be constituted, well, at least by midsummer, and that it could, at that point, have a feasibility study that's done by late fall, so that something might be introduced in the next legislature, but I don't know if that's an option.
Yeah.
But
Go
that
ahead.
would be a preference on my part.
Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I just want to point out, even if the Labor and Housing Committee recommends that this committee be reconstituted, and for some reason the legislature does not put an emergency on that bill, statutory adjournment is April 20th, which is always iffy in terms of whether the legislature actually adjourns on or about that day. But 90 days after that, so assuming no emergency, so 90 days after April 20th is July 19th. So that would give you a significant amount of time to sort of meet, regroup, and sort of go over what a feasibility study should include and go through an RFP process, et cetera. So that's without an emergency. So I think certainly you'd be looking at much more time than you have now.
Right.
I would like to add that, I mean, I've been on other special study committees, that like this one, like this one is, and this is the first one I've ever been on where there was money raised and the committee was charged with finding a contractor to do a study rather than just bring people in from the public and perhaps make recommendations to the original committee of jurisdiction. And it seems to me that in the way that the terms of the legislature work and the nature of like the temporary existence of a committee like this, that I think Michael Howard's suggestion makes sense to me. In other words, let's make it for 2 years so that the people, conservative people that are interested in it, that have been working on this issue, that we can do the RFP process and hire out a contractor and get the information, because otherwise we're always going to be kind of in the same situation, just based on how these study commissions usually go. So that's what makes sense to me.
Yeah. Okay. Is there anybody else from the public, Steve? I can't see if there's anybody else that may want to weigh in.
Looks like Peter Knight might want to. I'll promote him.
Yeah, if you can, go ahead, Peter, if you can introduce yourself and share your thoughts. Go ahead, Peter. I think you're on mute, Peter.
Sorry about that. I'm a part-time resident of Deer Isle in Hancock County, and one of the people who helped raise funds for this. And I just wanted to heartily endorse Mike Howard's proposal and the comments that have been made by others like Larry Danziger and Representative Colleen. It's so important to keep the ball rolling and not drop it, or as we say in Brazil, I lived 20 years there, let's not drop the peteca. It's like a kind of a shuttlecock you play on the beach. So I just wanted to lend my support to Mike Howard's proposition.
Great, thank you for that. Anybody else that may be with us that wants to weigh in? Is there nobody else with us? Okay, great. So we've heard all the options. We've had some discussion. Any further discussion? Michael Howard, go ahead.
Yeah, one other thing we talked about briefly in the last meeting was the possibility of raising some additional money that might enable a more substantial feasibility study, and the 2-year window would make that feasible as well. We may not raise the money. We may find that the kind of study we can get that could be delivered before this time next year might be all we need, but at least we would have that option. So anything that increases our flexibility, I think, is useful, especially given the uncertainty of some of when the legislature adjourns and all of these things that may give us unfortunate setbacks.
You're suggesting that our report, include the ability to raise more money and be able to do something more substantial if we could reconstitute a committee who chooses to do so?
Yeah, I would recommend that, that we ask for authorization to raise additional funds if needed for the study.
Yeah, because I just don't want to tie our hands having to raise a certain amount of additional money, but to have the option to be able to do that. And then if a group comes back and says, we can do a substantial study, but we need 40,000, then we could do that. Or if someone says they can do it for the 25, then we can just stick with what we've got, I think that makes sense. Go ahead, Sass, you had your hand up.
I did. I was for two things. One of them was the question about raising more money. And the other is unrelated to this particular decision. So if we want to finish this conversation, then I have another recommendation or like request of a recommendation that we would make, but we can finish this conversation first.
Peter Knight, you've got your hand up.
Yes, I do believe that it would be possible to raise additional funds, especially if we already had a terms of reference for an RFP and a proposed several one or more people or organizations prepared to do it. That would be a much more concrete opportunity than the one that we had when we still didn't know exactly what was going to happen. And nevertheless, we were able to raise this money. So I think we could do it if we had that. I just wanted to say that I have good reason to believe so.
Okay, thank you for that. Any additional discussion? Would someone like to make a motion?
I'll make a motion to go with Michael Howard's suggestion. So ask the committee be reconstituted as it exists now, so we can contract a study and get that information and then make recommendations to the Labor and Housing Committee.
Be reconstituted, given up to 2 years, and given the ability to raise additional funds if the committee sees fit to do that, or sees a need to do that. Okay.
I'll
Like-
second.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. I'd like to second it, that's all.
That's fine.
Okay.
We've got a motion from Representative Madigan and second by Representative Bernard. Lynn Caswell.
Would this motion include the emergency preamble or not?
Yes.
Yeah, we could recommend that. I mean, this.
And if we don't get it, then it becomes just a regular bill and no harm, no foul.
Yeah, we could try for it, because I mean, if we could get support from both sides of the aisle, we could get started sooner. So yeah, that would be great. Any additional discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of the motion made by Representative Madigan, please signify by using the raise your hand option.
This is Tracy Dillinger. I just wanted to chime in that I'm in support of this.
Okay. So you have all the votes, Steve? I believe that's unanimous of members present. So that motion carries. So any additional discussion by the committee? You had something, Sass, you wanted to bring up?
Yeah, I have I guess a procedural question and then possibly a recommendation. The recommendations that came out of the last committee, wherever these recommendations go, is it going to be the same people who are in the work session to decide whether or not they accept these recommendations? So that's a question I have.
You're asking if the members of the Labor and Housing Committee would be deciding?
I guess, yeah. Basically, I want to, let me be clear. I'm looking at the recommendation that got scrapped, and it really upset me because it was a really, really important recommendation, because we're not just a committee to study the feasibility of basic income. We're about basic income security, which means more than just basic income payments. We're also talking about how we can make sure people are secure. And so the people that were on that committee last time who have experienced poverty know how important looking at public assistance programs are. And so if you'll indulge me for just a moment, the recommendation that got scrapped in that work session was to create a permanent group through legislation that includes members from agencies and municipalities that administer safety net programs, impacted individuals that access safety net programs, and other stakeholders to examine current programs to increase the coordination of these programs, streamline the process for applying for benefits, make eligibility requirements clear and easy to understand, and if possible, create a one-stop resource that highlights what benefits may be available and how to access them. I don't know why it was scrapped, and I don't know if the people this is going to are those same people. And even if it is, maybe I'll just make them have to say no twice. But I really, really want us to do that. And I know that there are people working on that kind of stuff already. And so having this recommendation again might be more welcome this time, because I was part of the group that was working on ending hunger in Maine by 2030. And I know from a lot of conversations that happened with the groups of people that were involved with that, and there was tons, it was like 140 people, tons of them were legislators and people in DHHS and stuff like that, that they are actually looking at the possibility of creating a one-stop shop and all that kind of thing. And I just,
I'm going to jump in here and ask you a question, Seth. I sit on the Health and Human Services Committee, so I do know what you're talking about. And all through this committee, I've been thinking, gosh, there needs to be a way to make sure that this doesn't impact eligibility for food stamps or for housing vouchers or for Medicaid eligibility, all sorts of things. And I think that is something that should be a part of any recommendations, because of people say, oh, okay, there should be some sort of basic income security. If that cuts people's housing subsidy off or makes them pay more in rent, then we haven't achieved anything, right?
Yeah, especially if it's like Section 8 or Social Security, which sometimes take years to get.
Exactly. So I can see kind of the need for that. So the only thing I would say is that's not something that typically comes under the purview of labor and housing. So maybe one of the recommendations might be that there should be a report back also to folks in the Health and Human Services Committee, who are the folks who we typically kind of talk about that, things like eligibility or what kind of things, or what kind of eligibility requirements kind of make things more accessible or kick people off. You know, what happens if we raise the income eligibility? You know, what's the impact on folks who are, you know, just above that income, you know, kind of thing. That's typically the kind of thing we talk about. So I think that's important, that there is a discussion about that, and that folks that it will impact get a chance to have some say, or, you know, have put their input into that. That is really important.
And if we made that recommendation, by the time this committee is doing the thing in 2 years, there might, that if that permanent group had already been created and they were already looking at things, it could be really helpful to each other too.
Right.
Especially if we're looking at feasibility.
I would also say that if this committee does get reconstituted and we make this recommendation and all that, I mean, there will be a time when that study is being done that I think folks looking at that, I mean, there's no reason this committee couldn't ask folks from DHHS to come in and talk to about how they're having a one-stop shopping thing, or how folks might be trained to be able to assess the impact of different eligibility requirements on other programs. Does that make sense? I mean, because that would be someone we could ask those folks to come before us as well.
Mm-hmm.
So Sass, are you asking to sort of include that in our report and what we just approved that Michael Howard had proposed, or is this a separate?
Yeah, like an additional recommendation? Like there is Mike Howard's thing is like recommendation 1, and recommendation 2 is like the same thing that was in the other one.
Okay. So
and
like a second
whatever Representative Madigan just said about having it maybe go to the other committee instead of the Labor Committee, I don't know. Yeah, how, this is why there was also a recommendation of training in there, because I don't really know how these things
So
exactly.
you're proposing that we have a second recommendation to the Health and Human Services Committee of what you just sort of outlined, of something that was scrapped from before. Go
It
ahead.
makes sense to me because if you're going to do things, if you're going to be making recommendations that impact eligibility for other types of assistance, then folks in the Health and Human Services Committee should know about that.
Yeah. Steve, you got your hand up.
Yeah, so a couple things. So the bill that created this committee that you now sit on actually came from the Health and Human Services Committee. But in this iteration that you sit on, the report goes to the Labor and Housing Committee.
Oh, okay.
So in terms of recommending who it's reported back to or such, that's actually in the law. So it's in the resolve that it goes back to the Labor and Housing Committee. The other thing is, in terms of recommendations, I hear what Sass was saying, and I just want a little bit of clarity in terms of there was already sort of a draft bill, or a bill, excuse me, that was written that would have put in statute the group that Sass was looking for. So I don't know whether the intent is to have that as part of the recommendation, or so I'm just trying to figure out, is the recommendation to take that same recommendation, or is the recommendation that the legislation that the Labor and Housing Committee reports out include the statutory piece with the group? Because there's already been some drafting done on that, and that was the one that was scrapped in Health and Human Services.
So I understand this. It was scrapped, but there is legislation being made to actually create a group, even though it was scrapped in this. Oh,
so as
that
yeah,
feels
so
different
as
and
drafted
awesome.
as drafted in LD 1603, I believe it was.
Okay.
Actually, statutory language that constituted the group that you're looking for. So I'm just seeking clarity on whether the recommendation would be to the Labor and Housing Committee also include that in its bill with the
I
study
think if
again,
the-
or
Well, that seems a little duplicative. I mean, if it's already
Right.
done as part of another bill, then maybe we don't need to do it.
well, it was scrapped from the bill. So it was in the bill that created this committee. So the bill was set up, so structured in two parts. One part created the sort of intergovernmental agency working group. I believe it was in the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future. And the second part of the law, the second part of the bill created the study group that you now sit on. So going through the typical committee process, what happened was Section 1, which included that group, it was scrapped, but Section 2 was what's finally was enacted into law as the resolve that created the group that you now sit on. Does that make sense?
I think so. Is any further clarification needed by anybody?
Yeah, I guess I don't fully understand if what you're saying is that the recommendation I'm asking to include is that a permanent group be created to look at all of those things. Are you saying to me that that group is going to exist even if we don't put that recommendation in?
No, I'm sorry. What I was saying is, so that was a recommendation on the last group that you sat on.
Right.
And in terms of what the committee did with that, when they received the report back from the last group that you sat on, there was a part of a bill that would have done what you're now recommending. So I'm just trying to figure out going forward if you want that, your recommendation to be the same in terms of there should be a group, or you want the recommendation to say you should take this exact language from LD 1603 that was scrapped.
Michael Howard, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I'm feeling a little bit confused. I had heard from some people who were in touch with people in the legislature that recommendation that Sass brought up, it was taken out of the bill that reconstituted this committee, but there was an intention to go forward with it on a separate track. And I also heard that kind of got stalled, that nothing really got passed into law. And so I guess unless it would, create confusion in some way, I don't see any harm in our reaffirming what we recommended last time, whoever it goes to, just because it's connected with what we do. It's part of what we want a feasibility study to look at, because as far as I can see, the major objection at the state level to cash payments is the way that they might impinge on other benefits. And so we want to make sure that we know what we're doing. And we also want state agencies to be thinking about this in a sort of systematic way, as that recommendation would have them do.
Okay. So we'll
Right, and it would be permanent, which means that it could impact what we do, but also like there's always issues with one program kicking you off another program, and I keep thinking about the name of our committee, which is Basic Income Security. So it's more than those cash payments. I want those cash payments. I know they will change lives, but also making sure that there's really, some group that is taking a look at the way that these things interact with each other and make sure that they work in a way that is actually lifting people out of poverty instead of just keeping them just from starving to death, but they can just stay in poverty. We want to change that. So
Peter Knight, you've got your hand up.
Yes, with regard to exactly the problem that Sass and the others are referring to, there is an initiative here in Oregon called the Oregon People's Rebate, which institutes a minimum corporate profit tax and rebates it directly to people. And if anybody somehow loses access to one of the federal programs or the rest, the language of the law, which would become law if the thing passes and gets the required numbers of signatures to get on the ballot, would be compensated from the state budget. So it's a fail-safe built into the legislation, something that could be considered in Maine when the committee and its report are being considered.
Go ahead, Lynn Caswell, you've got your hand up.
Mr. Chair, it sounds like you may be headed for another motion. So I also want to just follow up on Representative Madigan's comment about having a report go to HHS as well. It would be possible to have the feasibility, it would be possible that if the group is reconstituted, that not only they report to HHS, to Labor and Housing, but they also report to HHS, that and both committees could have the authority to report out legislation, thereby allowing for this possibility that HHS could also do something that may be a little different than Labor and Housing. So I just want to throw that out for your consideration.
Okay. Would someone like to make a motion in that regard or on this item in general? Go ahead, Sass.
can I make a motion or does it have to be a legislator?
No, you can make a motion.
Make a motion.
So is your motion sort of what Lynn had just outlined?
Yes.
Okay. So we have a motion from Sass regarding what Lynn Caswell just outlined. Is there a second?
Would you state it, please, before a second is made?
Oh, me?
It doesn't matter as long as somebody states the motion before a second is made.
Yeah, maybe Lynn, maybe you could just recap what you just outlined for us.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I know that SAS made a motion for the report to also go to HHS, but I did not hear in that motion anything about the permanent commission.
Right. So I am making a motion that it also go to HHS and that we recommend the creation of a permanent group through legislation that includes members from agencies and municipalities that administer safety net programs, impacted individuals that access safety net programs, and other stakeholders to examine current programs in order to increase the coordination of these programs, streamline the process for applying for benefits, make eligibility requirements clear and easy to understand, and if possible, create a one-stop resource that highlights what benefits may be available and how to access them. And that was a lot of words. So if you need them, they're in recommendation 3 of the last time we did this thing.
Okay, is there a second to the motion? Seconded by Lori, motion made by Sass, committee discussion. Seeing none, all those in favor of the motion, please signify.
This is Tracy Bellinger. I approve of this motion.
So maybe Steve, you want to read off the names of those in support? I don't know if we're unanimous on this.
Let me see. Lori Moses is a yes. Senator Moore is a yes. Representative Bernard is a yes. Michael Howard is a yes. I think Sass Linikin is a yes. And Representative Rader, did you vote? You're yes? Okay. And then Senator Chipman,
Yeah, I'm for it.
you're yes. Okay. And Representative Madigan.
I'm a yes.
Okay.
And Tracy Bellinger indicated her approval vocally.
So I guess we're unanimous then. I wasn't sure. Okay, so that appears to be unanimous, so that motion carries. Any additional suggestions for recommendations or inclusions in our report? Go ahead, Representative Bernard.
Sorry, I forgot to take my hand down.
Okay, Lori Moses. Okay. Not seeing any more hands up for any more recommendations, so it seems like we may have concluded our work. Any committee discussion before we adjourn? So just a question. So Steve, you're going to prepare a report that has to be sent back to these committees by the 15th, right, on Wednesday. So is that something you're going to email out to everybody to, I guess, look at, make sure that it reflects our work? And
yep. So since this is our last meeting and we need to be mindful of Freedom of Access Act, so no reply all emails. I would defer sort of to the chairs of the committee if somebody has something that they consider to be a substantive change other than a typo or grammatical error, that sort of the chairs take it upon themselves to sort of direct me what to do as we're not meeting once again. But I certainly hope to have a draft out as quickly as possible, certainly within 24 hours.
Okay. So sometime tomorrow we'll all see the draft, and then if any clerical errors or typos need to be made, then that's fine. If there's any substantive changes, they would suggest those things to the chairs, and Representative Madigan and I would have to approve those. Okay.
Sounds good.
I guess that sounds good. So seeing no more discussion, I guess we'll someone wants to make a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Motion made by Representative Madigan to adjourn. Is there a second? Seconded by Representative Rotor. All those in favor?